So far we've looked at the Medici, and I told you about their rise to power in Florence that starts in the 15th century in a big way. And you have some major figures of the Medici family. The first big important guy of the Medici family is Cosimo de' Medici, and he's considered the founding father of the Medici line, at least in terms of power in Florence. And then you have Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent, as he was called, who really reigns in this golden age of Florence and commissions artists like Botticelli and other greats of the early Renaissance period. And of course, took Michelangelo into his household and gave him his real start in learning about humanism and being exposed to these ideas from antiquity and also modern discussions around philosophy, religion, and other areas of learning that really did have a big impact on Michelangelo as he was there, not to mention the exposure he gained from being exposed to the collections of the Medici family and being part of this sort of Academy of Art in Lorenzo's garden. So I also told you, though, that the Medici hit a rough spot, to say the least, when Savonarola comes into power. And the Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent ends up being damned by Savonarola, and he dies. And Lorenzo's son was just not very effective and couldn't fight off the power of Savonarola and ends up fleeing the city. The only work Michelangelo ever did for Piero, or at least so the story goes, was a snowman that Piero had him make. So, certainly that did not help matters, but we really start to see Michelangelo being disenfranchised with the ideas of the Medici, especially their desire for sole rulership over Florence. And Michelangelo does come under the sway of Savonarola, and that certainly feeds this growing dissatisfaction with the Medici family. So the Medici are exiled from Florence. As we saw already, Michelangelo gets commissions from the newly reinstated Republic of Florence after Savonarola is put to death. The Republic returns, and Michelangelo does the David among those other commissions that we saw for Palazzo Vecchio, including the cycle of battle scenes inside of Palazzo Vecchio that were started by Leonardo and Michelangelo. The Medici are always trying to get back to Florence and regain their power, and this certainly happens right in the time around 1512. Julius II, the Pope we saw, who had been the patron of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, had been a benefactor of the Medici. He was helping the Medici kind of negotiate their return to Florence. He dies in February of 1513. And what happens that really helps the Medici family is that the next pope to be elected is the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. His name was Giovanni, but his papal name is Leo X. And we came across Leo as we were looking at the fresco cycles that Raphael does in the papal apartments in the Vatican. Leo was elected as Pope on the 9th of March of 1513, and certainly Leo's ideas about the papacy was that the Medici should fully enjoy all that the papacy afforded them, and Leo famously spent a great deal of the papal treasury on his own palaces and entertainment, and also um, he helps to really help the Medici regain Florence, because Leo really works as not only as the Pope, but as the sort of de facto ruler of the city of Florence. And the Medici thus return to the city. The next Pope after Leo was a very unpopular Pope. His name was Adrian VI. He was probably killed, as unpopular popes often are. He was Dutch, and traditionally speaking, foreign popes do not fare well in the papacy, because there's so much local struggle for power, especially between Romans or Florentines or Milanese or Bolognese, that are vying to get the power of the papacy. So, frankly, during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, if you're a foreign pope, you know, it was certainly a good idea to have your food tested by someone to make sure it wasn't poisoned, which often happened. Anyway, after Adrian VI is gotten out of the way, then another Medici pope is named, and that's Clement VII. Clement was the bastard son of Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, who had been killed in the Pazzi conspiracy. The importance of these two Medici popes is, as I said with Leo, this reestablishment of power of the Medici family in Florence. Clement II serves as de facto ruler of Florence, and in their work in trying to reestablish the power of the family in the city, they returned to some of the traditional Medici sites of patronage, like San Lorenzo, which was really the Medici church in the city. This is the Church of San Lorenzo. San Lorenzo had this whole area is San Lorenzo. This is the little monastery that's attached to it with a courtyard in the middle. But this whole thing, this is the part of the church as well. The Church of San Lorenzo was begun in the early Renaissance period. It was designed by Brunelleschi, who was the builder of the dome of the Florence Cathedral. And the Medici had negotiated for absolute authority over San Lorenzo, and especially over its decoration. They demanded that only their coat of arms be displayed here, among other things. And they helped pay for a good part of the rebuilding and redecoration of this church. It had fallen into great disrepair. It was the first church of Florence. It was ordained, I think, in like 424 or somewhere around there, and had fallen into disrepair and needed to be rebuilt. And so the Medici helped fund that, but they don't give that money away for free. They demand that their coat of arms be in the church exclusively, and they demand right to burial in the church. This is another view. This is of the facade of the church. And what you can see here is that the facade is unfinished, and it had never been completed. And this had rather bothered the Medici, since this is a church so closely associated with them. And I should point out that the Medici Palace is just diagonally across the street from San Lorenzo. So they really are connected in every way. The facade had never been finished, though various plans had been put forward from the beginning of the construction. Just none of it had ever been done. And so there was an idea by these new, as the Medici are reestablishing their power, Leo X has the idea that there should be a competition to see who should win the commission for the design and building of the facade for the Church of San Lorenzo. So the competition is held, and we had a winner with Michelangelo. And this competition happens around 1516. I know that's cut off at the bottom there. But Michelangelo conceived of an incredibly elaborate facade for this church. Um, it is, we have here the wooden model to show us exactly what it looks like. All of the architects that were in sort of the final round of competition submitted models for this project so that they could better explain the ideas that they had about what the facade would look like. Michelangelo's plan was that this wasn't just sort of a veneer, a facade, just a layer on the front. It's an actual full structure that would be attached onto the front of San Lorenzo, and it would create a narthex space, so a kind of intermediary space between your entrance into this portal area and before you entered into the main part of the nave of the church. So Michelangelo's plan was a big facade, a big block of a building, really, that would be attached onto the church. And his plan was that the whole thing would be done in marble and that the facade would be covered in sculptures, both in marble, reliefs and marble freestanding sculptures, and bronze, with bronze reliefs in particular. And it was going to be an incredibly expensive project, actually, which probably is what eventually does it in. Michelangelo does win the competition, and he goes to the marble quarries in Carrara to start excavating the marble from there. Streets are built precisely to ship the marble from up in the hills in Carrara and make its long and difficult passage to Florence. This was an incredibly difficult and elaborate process that would take a lot of money and many, many months to, have things even show up. Things do start to show up in Florence. Pieces that were blocked out to make columns from certainly arrive in Florence. However, the Medici changed their mind about continuing on with the project, again, probably because of how expensive the thing was going to be. And also, it was clear it was going to take a really long time to actually see this thing completed. And so they turned their attention to a different project. Just a few weeks ago, well, in April anyhow, there was this post circulating on Facebook, so that's where I have to pull it up most quickly. But anyway, I just wanted to show you there, an architect in Italy did a reconstruction using computer, obviously, of what the facade would have looked like had Michelangelo completed it. So I think it really helps to give you a better sense of what he was going for and how it would have looked on the church. I mean, we're lucky to have the wooden model still, but to see it this way is pretty impressive.